I was sitting with my father and my uncle in my father's 1-bedroom apartment over on Austin Boulevard in Oak Park when that story broke that night. And like they're pulling the bodies out. Like I think it was like the second body they had pulled out. And they then cut to this short little lawyer. And my father's like, holy shit, I know that guy.
Bob Motta, Dan, legal lawyer, attorney, legal commentator, legal show host.
I got to know Bob through our mutual colleague Barbara McDonald of Court TV, through all our coverage of the Delphi murders. And Barb ran into him at CrimeCon and decided, you know what, you and Dan should meet. So she introduced us, and since then we've had a great friendship blossom. And he is the host of the Defense Diaries podcast and YouTube show. His father was John Wayne Gacy's defense attorney, and to this day he continues the work of trying to uncover more potential victims of John Wayne Gacy.
I couldn't help but be fascinated by the story he was telling us about trying a murder case with his father and his wife.
Seems like almost sounds like a sitcom, right?
Yeah. So Bob Motta, also Chicago Bears fan, just like yourself. So you're
just
united
like myself,
under
yes.
that.
We do have that in common. We have
yes.
we have that common pain point.
Yes, and he's very. There is no doubt that Bob is a Chicago guy. You can hear it in his voice, his accent, the way he talks. He's just he is Chicago through and through.
Let's get to our conversation with Bob. We'll talk about all those things, and of course, wouldn't it be a conversation with Bob Motta and us without getting a little bit into the murders in Delphi, Indiana, of Abigail Williams and Liberty German, and the conviction of Richard Allen. Without further ado, the Deviant off-script conversation with one Bob Motta. Full transparency, Bob is a friend of mine, and I'm not saying like he's a friend of mine in the way that politicians say it or other people in media say it. Bob is genuinely friend with a capital F, and I'm so happy that he's come to join us here on Deviant off script. Bob, thank you so much for being here with us.
Wow, my pleasure, man. I love hanging with you guys, and you guys are doing great work.
Is it Bob Motta Esquire?
Technically, yes. I've pretty much retired from practicing. If we have a trial that pops up and Allie's like, hey, you need to bring it back into the ring, then I'll step back in there. I'm active. I keep my license active, but the podcast really takes up all my time, as well as the YouTube. So I just don't, because I'm trying to ring the bell with that stuff, man. So you can't half-ass it. You got to go all in, which I warned her and she approved of when I decided I was going to do it a few years ago. So she's always the hero of the story.
What made you sort of make that career shift, from being a practicing attorney into, the successful show you have now?
You know what? It was frankly the pandemic. Once the pandemic hit, I was about 20 years into my law career as a trial attorney. And I knew heading into the pandemic that I was getting burnt out. I just didn't have the same fire that I had for many, many years. And, I kept telling Allie, my wife, who's my law partner as well, I'm concerned. I just don't have the drive to do this anymore. I'm not enjoying it, and I realize that a lot of people out there do jobs that they don't enjoy. But for me, I felt like I had a viable option, and I had been tinkering. I had always wanted to write a book, which at the beginning of the pandemic I started, and I was doing I wanted to do kind of legal thriller, Grisham type, Michael Connelly type stuff. So I got about 300 pages into my novel. And I had been holding on to these tapes that my father had given me so many years ago that I think we've probably talked about, where my dad was Gacy's his trial attorney back in 78 through 80. And I had never done anything with them. And they were these audio tapes of him prepping Gacy for trial, which were very unique. and very interesting in their own right. And I thought that they had some historic value. It's a seedy underbelly type historic value, but it's a historic value nonetheless. It's part of the fabric of our country, like it or not. And I had listened to Serial, like I think probably in 2017, like years after it came out. And I was like, wow, I really like this media form. Like I think it's amazing. It's kind of like an audiobook, except better, because you can conduct interviews, you can stick in, other sound that you want. You can really kind of build it out however you want to. And you don't have the parameters that you have if you're a documentary filmmaker. You can tell the story how you want it to be told. And I loved everything about the medium. So I was like, I was tinkering with the concept for a long time, and I talked to a bunch of friends, a lot of them in the music industry. And I was telling them about the concept of me doing it. And they're like, do it, it'll be awesome. And so when the pandemic hit and they shut the courts down like cold, it was the first time in like 2 decades that I had been able to really reset mentally. And I realized at that moment in time that was the perfect opportunity for me to dive into this thing, because I figure I'm a decent writer. I can tell a pretty good story. And I got that skill from really being a trial attorney, because at the heart of it, that's what a trial attorney is a storyteller. And I figured I've got this first source material that no one else on the planet has. Give it a shot. And ultimately, that's what I did. I mean, ironically, I had initially tried to license the tapes, the sound, to Joe Berlinger. If you're not familiar with him, he's a huge true crime documentarian. He's just dropped the John Benet Ramsey thing. Sent him a flyer like the day that his Bundy tapes, Conversations with a Killer thing dropped on Netflix. I just Googled him, found his email address, said, hey, man, I've got some tapes that you might be interested in. I think they're moderately more interesting than what you used in Bundy, but you did a great job on that. But these are different. These are a defense attorney speaking with his client. Gacy had waived privilege, which does survive death. But that's how he intended on Sam and my father getting paid back in the day. So, I had free reign to use them, and he was interested. Like I thought maybe I'd get, a response from his team at some point. And 5 minutes after I sent the email, Berlinger's like, yep, I'm going to loop you in with my producer, and we'll see if we can work something out. And like, I negotiated for 9 months. I talked to a lot of people about what they thought the value of that was in terms of the sound, because the tapes themselves, maybe to some weirdo collector, that would have some value. But other than that, it's the intrinsic value is the sound. And once it's out there, it no longer has any value. So talked to a lot of people. They all kind of gave me what they thought that the things might be worth in terms of trying to negotiate. And I just couldn't get Berlinger anywhere near that. And then I killed that deal after 9 months of negotiating it. And then I think I was close. I got a more substantial offer from, I want to say Discovery. But ultimately, and I was discussing it with my father as well. We ended up killing that deal as well, which was all a blessing for me, because ultimately that's when I decided I'm going to do the podcast. So that's when I had the conversation with my wife, where I went and asked her, hey, are you willing to allow me to do this? Because that means I have to leave the firm, which is leaving it all to you, which is a huge ask on my part. And her, being the amazing person that she is and my partner and everything, of course, said without question immediately. And I promised her at that point, I said, I'm going to go all in. I'm not going to limp in on this thing. So ultimately I needed to find a producer, because I realized in very short order I had no idea what I was doing on the sound end of it, man. And it was like,
quickly,
like I bought some cheap ass microphone and some shitty little interface, and plugged it into my shitty computer, and realized like within 15 minutes, I'm like, I have no idea what I'm doing, and I don't want it to sound like some schmuck in his garage. because I probably could have gone to Wondery or any of the big media companies and sold the concept to them, but in that situation, they would have wanted control over the creative side of it. And I was not willing to do that. So, it's taken me longer to build the thing grassroots wise, because I really had to do all the marketing myself. And obviously, you guys know, the social media component of that. If you're grassroots, if you don't have Wondery type money to go out and just get your thing launched out there on a massive scale, that, you've really got to do it from the ground up, and you've got to do it one listener at a time, which is exactly what I did. And it took me, probably about a year and a half. Like that first season still has not had enough years on it. Like eventually someday it will, because it's really my magnum opus. Things like, I'm incredibly proud of it. It's fascinating, and it's 36 episodes long. And it's like, I don't know that there's a podcast like it.
Yeah.
You're never
like, how many episodes? Damn, Bob.
Because, it's funny, Bob, you talk about it being your magnum opus. Like, you're never going to think that there's enough years on it. It doesn't. There could be 150 million people that listen to it. You're going to think should have been 152.
That's a true story, man. Yeah, that's a true story. But I and it was oddly cathartic for me, because I didn't realize, that case had always just been a weird part of my life. My father having represented him. And,
let's talk about that a little bit. John Wayne Gacy, the serial killer, John Wayne Gacy, operated here in the Chicago area where Bob and I live. And if you're not familiar with him, if you're listening to this, you probably are. But if you're not, he was a serial killer, active in the mid 70s. What was his total victim count? Was it 18?
33.
33. 18 times 2 almost, and possibly counting. And he was a huge deal here in the Chicago area. He lived out in Des Plaines by the O'Hare Airport. And, he's the guy who police found all these bodies buried in his crawl space. But as Bob mentioned, his father was his defense attorney for a while. And I can only imagine that high profile of a case must have shaded your life from an early point.
It did. I was fortunate in the sense that my parents had divorced when I was younger. So I was probably about 5. So I fortunately was living in Colorado at the time, because my stepfather had decided he wanted to, late in life, wanted to go to officer candidate school at the Air Force Academy. So we ended up moving out to Colorado Springs right around the time that trial was starting. So matter of fact, I had come back for my first winter break visitation. The night I was sitting with my father and my uncle in my father's 1-bedroom apartment over on Austin Boulevard in Oak Park, when that story broke that night. And they're pulling the bodies out. I think it was the second body they had pulled out. And they then cut to this short little lawyer. And my father's like, holy shit, I know that guy. He's like, that's Sam Amoranti. And my father's like, gets up, starts pacing. He's like, and my father had just left the public defender's office from 26 in California, which is, the house of pain. That's Cook County's main courthouse, where, all the city of Chicago goes into. All the criminals get tried there. And he was the head of the felony division there for a long time. And then he decided to hang his shingle. So this thing breaks. My father's like, he's like, my God, he's like, should I reach out to him? Should I send him a Western Union? And, that's a true story, man. It's like, this this is, 78, December of 78. And I'm like, yeah, Dad, I'm like 10. I'm like, yeah, that'd be awesome. I have no idea. What?
Do it. Yeah.
Do it. It'll be cool. You'll be on TV. That kind of thing. So he sends Amoranti the Western Union the following day. Amoranti calls him back almost immediately. My dad freezes up in that first conversation. And again, remember, this was a process in terms of them unearthing the bodies at Gacy's property. This went on for months. So I think probably by the time that call came in from Sam, they were probably at 8 or 9. So like my dad gets involved in that case, like not knowing what the extent of it's going to be, not knowing that it was going to take on the life that it did in terms of publicity, because frankly, we had a very similar serial killer down in Texas, Dean Corll, who kind of the same MO, short of like the clown thing, but same thing, like his victims were all young men. All the crimes seemed to be sexually motivated, and he had two accomplices. And so very, very, very similar MOs. And, but you didn't really hear anything about Corll. Like that wasn't like that for whatever reason, that didn't pick up the steam that Gacy did nationally, and especially in the city of Chicago. So fortunately, I did not live with my dad while that trial was taking place in the city. I ended up moving in with my father when I was starting 7th grade, because my mother and my stepfather were moving to Spain, which when I was 12 years old freaked me out. I'm like, where? This is pre-internet, so it's like all about foreign countries is very little as a 12-year-old in the 70s, man. It's like you saw it maybe on a map, but you had no idea what Spain meant. Very different times. We weren't nearly as knowledge based as we are now. So moving with my father, and even like starting 7th grade, I took some heat because everybody knew who my dad was in the city, around the city of Chicago. So, I could only imagine what it would have been like as a child growing up, because people have a tendency to kind of, glom the defense attorney on with the horrible acts of the client themselves.
Okay, this guy, you must be a bad person too.
Exactly. So, that was kind of.
What kind of grief did you catch?
Just like a lot of kind of just ugly things said to me, but I was, I wasn't one to be pushed around really. So like in terms of kind of being bullied, and back then, like they didn't talk about bullying like they do now, like it's really frowned upon, like, but I was able to kind of weather the storm in terms of, and plus I was articulate enough to explain, I'm like, look, like that was like, they weren't trying to say he was innocent of the crimes. They were trying to say that he was insane, man. I mean, it's like, I understood the practice of law, and in particular how defense work goes, and kind of the importance of it at a very early age, by way of my father explaining it to me. You know what I'm saying? Because it was always the question that always is asked by everybody still now, like, how can you defend somebody like that?
Yeah, well, it's funny because, your dad's serving as a defense attorney for John Wayne Gacy, and you, to a certain extent, are defending your father to the courtroom that you're going into every day, which is school.
Right. Exactly. It's exactly what it was. And throughout the course of like my life, like kind of, that was always the number one question, just how can you defend somebody, like morally? How do you check your morals at the door and do that job? And, so I became very skilled at explaining that situation, which when I finally decided to pivot into a podcast, I decided that was going to be one of my primary platforms, was really trying to enlighten people as to what defense attorneys really mean to us as citizens in this country, because we're misconstrued. People just think, you're trying to get scumbag criminals off or murderers off. And that's just not what we do.
What made you go into the family business, your father's family business?
Oddly enough, I fought it at first.
Yeah.
I left college and I went into social work for 5 years.
Where'd you go to school?
Eastern Illinois was where I graduated from college, and then I went to law school at Chicago, Kent. But when I met my first wife in college, we got married, didn't have any kids, rather short marriage. And, but during that point in time, like I wasn't feeling law school. Like I didn't want to go straight into 3 more years right out of college. And I actually wanted to work with DCFS. I wanted to work with kids. I wanted to try to help kids. And I went and took the state exam for them twice, got 100 each time, couldn't even get an interview. Like that was back during the late 80s, early 90s, where I think they thought it strange that a man would be applying for that job, because that's a traditionally woman dominated field in terms of social work. So I thought it was weird that I couldn't even get an interview, but so ultimately I ended up working with seniors with Catholic Charities for 5 years, which was very fulfilling. I enjoyed the work. You can't make a living doing it. Like, honestly, it's undervalued. So it's underpaid. And plus, women do it. So like always, they get screwed on the money side of it. So, I realized about 4 years in, I'm like, well, I gotta make a choice here. And so that's when I took the LSAT and did pretty well on that, and ended up going to the same law school my father went to. I like the concept of him being able to put my hood on me when I graduated, which is what happened. Chicago, Kent in the city. So it's a great law school that no one's heard of. But like in terms of the hierarchy in Chicago, it was always University of Chicago, Northwestern, and then arguably between Kent and Loyola in terms of, best law schools in the area. I had gotten into several schools, but ultimately I kind of wanted to stay local. And I was older and I was married. So like those things all kind of like, I like the concept of going away wasn't really something that I was interested in. So I ended up sticking local, and did that for a long time.
Plan?
Yeah. I always wanted to litigate. And I think there's a misconception about people that go to law school. It's, like we all have those friends that, you'll get in a disagreement with, and, they'll be like, oh yeah, everybody says I should be a lawyer because I'm good at arguing. And, so like, I think everybody has this concept that people go to law school to be trial lawyers. And shockingly, probably about 5 to 7% of people that attend law school actually turn out to be trial lawyers. It's very, very few. It's a very, very limited number of people actually become litigators, and even a fewer number become criminal trial lawyers, whether it be prosecutors or defense attorneys. I think
listening to you is almost the same exact story I've heard from my brother. He went to school law school specifically to become a litigator. He went into criminal, he became a prosecutor, then he became a defense attorney. He's a judge now. But yeah, he tells me, like, they're the few of the few, right?
Yes, it's true. It's true. And it's like the practice is you have to have a thick skin, especially from the defense side of it. You cannot go into it, and your brother will tell you you have to have a thick skin on the bench as well. Because you are inevitably, like every judge will tell you, depending on what court they're in, especially like if they're in family law courts, they're like, if I ever see somebody smiling walking out of my courtroom after a divorce case, I know I didn't do my job. You like, is the kind of the equality equation of that means that people are losing things that they don't think that they should be losing in those divorce cases. So, like usually everybody's a little bit upset when walking out of divorce court. And, from the criminal defense side of it, it's just a situation where you're dealing with somebody's liberty, whether they did it or they didn't do it, depending on, there's so many factors involved. It's like, I think people have a tendency to kind of think that all crimes are murder, especially like true crime fans, because that's the cases that we focus on, right? I mean, we don't focus on assaults and batteries. Like we focus on the murders, but the reality is a massive portion of the practice has nothing to do with homicides. It's all the other crimes that are committed on a daily basis. And, most cases are pled out. That's just the reality of it. Most of the time the cops get it right, because most of the time criminals are not very bright.
What percentage of defense attorneys do you think actually get murder cases?
Very low percentage. Very low percentage. And beyond that, it becomes a question of, if you're in private practice, nominal, like a very, very small amount, because they don't have the money to afford a criminal defense attorney. Like a good attorney is probably going to command anywhere from 350 upwards 1,000 to try a murder case, because it's a massive amount of work. It just is.
Which is, it's funny because they always, anytime you see there's a criminal trial that gets a lot of attention, and it's always, oh, the defendant's in there with this high-priced defense attorneys. It's like, well, they're all high-priced because it's expensive work.
Right.
There's a reason for that.
Right. Exactly. And I mean, when we took on the Garcia case, which was a quadruple homicide, our client was a doctor, former doctor, who had been accused of killing 4 people over a 5-year period in 2 double homicides. And it was in Omaha, Nebraska. So we're obviously not licensed in Nebraska, so we had to get admitted pro hoc vice. I brought my father in on that case. That was the only case I tried with him. So it was me, Allison, and my dad trying that case. And if I were to calculate what we made hourly based on how much time and resources that we spent in trying that case, it would probably be below minimum wage. Yeah. I mean, like, you know what I'm saying? That case took 4 years. It shuts down the rest of your practice. There's just a lot of factors involved with private practice that I think that people just don't understand. And like, you just truly do not get into criminal defense work if you're trying to ring the bell as an attorney. Like, that's not where you're getting rich. I mean, you get rich in the civil cases. If you're going to be trying to make some dough on the criminal side, you're going white collar crime. Because you have to have clients that can pay. So most defense attorneys that handle the most murders are always going to be public defenders, always.
What was it like doing a trial with your dad?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was about to ask. That must have been a really cool experience.
It was a long time in coming. And my dad had always said, if you ever get a heavy duty murder case, I'll try it with you. And he was late in his career. And frankly, I think after that case, I think that took it out of him. Mm-hmm. And oddly enough, he let me first chair it. So I first chaired it. He was my second chair. Between Allie and I mean, when Allie was on the case, which is a whole nother thing, because she got booted from the case right before trial for various reasons, but that was a very hard fought case out there in Omaha, Nebraska. But my dad, we kind of like divvied up what we were going to do. He's like, I was going to handle law enforcement. He was going to handle kind of the science side of it. So, the medical examiners and the cross examinations of, anybody that was kind of science based. And I was going to handle a majority of the lay witnesses in law enforcement. And, and it was a long trial. It was a 5-week trial, but it was a great experience, and it was unusual because, you're hanging up that father-son hat and you're putting on your lawyer hats, so it can get combative, because when you're trying a case, it doesn't matter who they are in terms of who your trial partner is. You're not going to think of everything the same way because we're human beings. So conceptually, in terms of a theory of defense, we may have very different ideas on how to defend the case properly. So kind of that part of it was really fascinating. And, even though I was first chair, I would always defer to my father. I mean, the guy had vast experience, and it's like that I couldn't even begin to compare with. And so I was glad that we were able to do it. I think it really ended up taking a lot out of him, that trial. Cause it was, like I said, he was in his mid 60s. So, and if you've ever tried a case like this, it's mentally, physically exhausting. Yeah. And it takes a lot out of you because it's all encompassing. You're not focusing on anything else for a period of, years, where that's kind of the only thing you're thinking about because it's just that much work. So I was happy to have that opportunity to do that with them, though, for certain.
Was there ever a moment when you were like, get him, Pop, get him?
Yeah. A bunch of those moments. Yeah. Because I was probably the way that the dynamics worked out is Allison and I were the more fiery young attorneys out in Omaha. And again, we went out there, it was a death penalty case. So, I laid the groundwork immediately. I said, look, They're trying to execute our client. My client has maintained his innocence from the minute that we met him. And we're going to put the state's feet to the fire. If they're going to execute our client, they're going to have to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt, and we don't practice here. So that gives us free reign to go scorched earth, because like where we practice typically, you got to play nice. These are judges that you're in front of all the time. These are prosecutors that you're working with all the time. You develop relationships over the years and you have multiple clients. You can't go in there flame throwing everybody without a care in the world as to what's going to happen tomorrow when I have other clients that are in front of those same judges that have those same state's attorneys that are overseeing those cases. And I don't want there to be some kind of residual payback, even if it's subconsciously because they're pissed at me because I'm acting like a jerk off. You know what I'm saying? So like in the Omaha case, it was like, we're never going to practice here again. So like we can be however we want. If we want to be aggressive,
it's like being on a cruise, right? Like we could be whoever.
Right. Exactly. It's like, like whenever we go on vacation, we're like, all right, we're all going to do British accents for the first 3 days, So yeah, I mean, kind of that concept, but, it was, and my dad was kind of the sage old lawyer. He was the calming force. He was the one that the judge, frankly, would want to address my father because he was easier to deal with than I was, So it was kind of a cool dynamic, and it was one that we all leaned into in terms of how that played out. But yeah, no, I definitely leaned on the old man quite a bit.
Was that your most memorable case?
Yeah, for certain. I mean, that's that kind of case that you'll just, maybe the biggest criminal defense attorneys out there will get 2-3 of those cases in their career, but it's just one of those cases where you're not going to get those type of cases because they just don't exist and they don't make it to trial.
Yeah.
I mean, like that's the bigger thing. Like I said, most of the time they get pled out, and, we've got a lot of big cases out there. Like right now, we got Hewerman going over in New York. And like by all indications, the way that that's being portrayed by defense counsel at this point is like it's going to trial. Yeah. That doesn't mean anything. Most of our cases pled out on the eve of trial because typically they'll make an offer early. If it's a death penalty case, they're not making an offer at all. Or if they are, they're saying, okay, here's the offer. We'll take the death penalty off the table, life in prison without the possibility of parole. And that's your offer, but for like every other type of case, the state will typically make an early offer and you'll go to your client. You'll say, well, this is what the offer is. We'll say, well, what do you think? I'll say, well, we need to wait and get the discovery first. Let's see what they got against you, because our clients are always saying I didn't do it, so it's like, all right, well, let's see what they got. And then when that comes in, we'll sit down, we'll look at it and I'll say, all right, well, we got some problems here. They've got a lot of evidence against you and it's pretty powerful. So do you want me to talk to them about a plea agreement? And then those plea negotiations will start, and that, like any kind of negotiation in anything, whether it be business or anything else, contracts, there's give and take, and, you're trying to create leverage by filing motions to suppress. And if you think one is powerful and maybe they're going to get some evidence suppressed, that you have a little more leverage at that point in time than you might otherwise. So that's a point where you're going to go in and say, because like ultimately what we're trying to do, if we've come to the realization as the attorneys, like, okay, this guy did this. So like, but this is what the crime is, and they're overcharging him and, or they're making an offer that's obscene. It's too much time. The punishment's not fitting the crime, because ultimately that's what the goal is. Try to make the punishment fit the crime, because the state, they're the government. They're like, I'm dealing with the human side of it because I'm dealing with the clients. They're dealing with a piece of paper and a statute on all their cases, and then they've got obviously the concept of like, we're trying to bring justice to the families if it's that type of case. But if you have cases where they're victimless crimes, like drug cases, or, there's many cases that are victimless crimes, you don't have that family aspect. So you're always trying to get them to say, hey, look, this is an 18-year-old kid who did something really stupid. Like I'm not asking for a free pass here, but let's not flamethrow their life moving forward by hanging a felony up on them. Let's kick it down to a misdemeanor, hammer them with community service. If you want them to do some counseling or what have you, whatever, let's figure it out. So like those kind of negotiations are really the bulk of what
finding the middle ground between the law and actual justice.
Right. Exactly.
You mentioned something just now. All the clients say that they're innocent, right? Or many clients say that they're innocent. What would you say? You probably shouldn't answer this as a defense attorney, but what percentage of people do you think are actually innocent? People go to jail. Innocent people get arrested all the time. But what percentage of clients that go to trial or plea are actually innocent, do you think?
It's hard to know. Like typically, if you are ending up going to trial, and just understand that the premise is that decision is not the lawyer's decision. Like ultimately, whether or not a client decides to go to trial is 100% their decision. Now, obviously, we can advise them. We can say, look, they have very powerful evidence. There is such a thing as trial tax. If we go to trial and it's super evident to this judge that you've just wasted this court's time in this county or this state's money, then you're going to pay a heavier price than if we take a plea agreement. Or in the alternative, you can do what's called a blind plea, wherein you're saying, hey, we're not going to accept the state's offer. We're going to the judge. We're going to give them like an overview of what the evidence is, kind of like pitch our client a little bit and then say, Your Honor, what would you theoretically sentence this person to if we were to go to you to set the number? So you could do those two options, but so understanding that it's the client that makes the choice whether or not to go to trial. And if they're not wise enough to listen to their attorneys, which believe me, there's plenty of those people out there, a vast majority of them are guilty. A vast majority of them are guilty. Are there people that are certainly have been convicted wrongfully? Absolutely. There just are. But most of the time, if you go through the process and the evidence is substantial and the jury hears it, they're typically going to get convicted, and typically they're just convictions. You can just look at the percentage of it. Most of the time the right person's going down on it, and most of the time it's via a plea. Mm-hmm. So, our jails are filled with people that have pled out. Now, it's a whole different conversation for us to have, talking about what the state does in terms of their power and their leverage that they have and getting people that may not be guilty. And again, try to not think of everything in terms of murder. Like we all have a tendency, because that's the world we live in. Just think about all the other crimes that take place, all the other stuff that goes on. Like those are where the real battles are fought in the criminal courts in this country. So, and it's not always evident if they're guilty or not.
Let me ask you, as an attorney from your standpoint, and now really more of somebody who observes the American justice system from kind of a different perspective. What do you think the biggest, I'm going to kind of use a couple different words, but what do you think the biggest problem or hang up or hurdle, what is it that's throwing sand in the wheels of the justice system these days?
Money, or the lack thereof. The way that the system is built is that you just cannot get the type of representation you need on a global scale in terms of per defendant, because they simply don't have the money to try cases. The cases that you see that just get litigated to the death, where you're watching these cases and they've spent, like Karen Reed's a perfect example of that. If Karen Reed doesn't have hundreds of thousands of dollars to hire not but one, but two, Yannetti and Jackson, pretty high profile attorneys to handle her case, do you think that thing has taken on the life that it's taken on? There's not a chance. That thing is just a woman who theoretically, either purposefully or accidentally, ran into her boyfriend or didn't. You know what I mean? And it's like that case has no legs. It's got no publicity. But when you hire two highly skilled, highly trained criminal defense attorneys that start digging into the case and have the time to do it because they've been paid to do it, you know, that's the type of result you can get. So like you see the dichotomy of that all over the place. Like no one in this country is able to afford that, or at least a vast majority of defendants in this country cannot afford that kind of defense. Could you imagine if every case was tried like that? Like where there is some kind of question as to whether or not the crime actually was committed by that person. I mean, like no matter where you fall on Karen Reed, there exists the possibility that she did not hit him because the injuries don't line up, you know, but then you've got the broken taillight. So there exists this possibility that either one of those things could have happened. And, you know, without having the money to hire great counsel that has all the time in the world, because public defenders can be amazing, brilliant attorneys. Their problem is always going to be time. Yeah. They just don't have the time to commit to one client because they've got a huge caseload. So like, that's always going to be the thing. So to me, it's always going to boil down to money. And it's just, you know, in order to combat the incredible power of the government with their resources, and you know, they have just the arm of the law at their disposal at any time. They just have, it's a really, really hard fight, you know, where you're always going to be the underdog when you're going against the government. That's just the reality of it. So, and if you're going in unarmed or, you know, underfunded, you know, you can imagine how hard that is to overcome that if you don't have the resources to do it. If you can't go and combat their witnesses, especially expert witnesses, by hiring your own because your client doesn't have the money to do it, you know, I mean, what can you do? You know, so that inequitable part of it is always going to be the money equation. And
I asked you that because, you know, I've had people ask me that question in instances where we're kind of talking about all of this. And generally my answer is usually the same. And that is, you know, you have to have money in order to survive any kind of criminal charges. If you are, you know, if you don't have the money, you are dead in the water, man.
You are.
And if you don't have the money and you didn't do it, it's even worse.
It's a nightmare.
And that is starting from a place of presumption of innocence, even though that's what the nice words say, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, you know, I've never walked into a courtroom, into a trial, not feeling like I didn't have to prove my client was innocent.
Right.
Never. You know, that's just not, you know, and you find it out during voir dire, which is that process where you're picking the jury and, you know, you get to ask them questions. It's that there is no more important phase of a trial than selecting that jury, because ultimately those 12 people hold your client's fate in their hands. So you're trying to really just cull as much information about those humans as you can from a very limited amount of information that you get from a juror information form, and then whatever questions you're allowed to ask them. And then you've got so many factors involved in terms of what type of case is it? Has harm befallen a child? Do I want moms on this case? Because mama bears can be really scary when you're talking about an injured child, you know? So it's like, and you're trying to figure out who is the right type of juror for this case. Do we want somebody that's highly educated, or is that potentially going to hurt us? You know, because they're going to overthink it. You know what I mean? So there's just so many things involved with it. And again, it boils down to the time that the attorneys have to allot to those cases. And that's just why you're not seeing public defenders who, again, can be, my father's one of the finest attorneys I know. The guy's brilliant. And he was a PD for a long time. So like they can be amazing attorneys, but they're always going to have that issue of not having the time to put into the cases. And they're also going to have probably more resources than a client who has enough to hire a lawyer, but doesn't necessarily have enough to fund the defense itself. You know, because there's a different
thing, right?
It's a whole different thing, man. Yeah. It's two different, completely different things. So, you know, because like typically in a criminal case, you're getting your retainer up front. You know, you're not billing it hourly. Mm-hmm. You know, you're saying it's a flat fee. This is what we're going to charge. And you come to that fee by saying, okay, this is how much work we think we're going to have to do on it. And you calculate it, you know, like it's one of those things where, you know, trying to explain why lawyers make money in terms of like the hourly is like, well, it's really hard to explain because we don't have any evidence of what we do because it's all up here aside from writing pleadings, I mean, everything else is in your mind. That's where most of your work is done. Doctors, okay, you put a cast on, there's proof for your work. You perform surgery, there's proof for your work. You work on a line in a factory, there's the stuff we just made. You see how you're earning your money. Whereas with us, it's different, you just, cause you can't really show your work in a way that most professions can. So, yeah, man, I've said it once and I'll say it a million times more. I don't know that there's a tougher gig on the planet than criminal defense attorney.
Just being conscious of your time here. I know, obviously, you're known for your work on the Gacy, on the Gacy case. You're also known for your work on Delphi, which we'll get into just shortly. But you're also doing some great work telling the story of one of Chicago's most corrupt cops. And just like, tell people about that. Tell us how you got into that. Tell us a little bit about that story.
So, yeah, it really dovetails into Gacy. Mm-hmm. So when I started the Gacy season, I was probably about 10, 12 episodes in, and I had an old Chicago cop, former homicide detective, reach out to me named Bill Dorsch. And Dorsch is like, "Oh my God, I've been looking for you for 25 years. Where have you been my whole life?" He's like, "I've been listening to your podcast. It's amazing. I want to work with you." He's like, "I've been digging into Gacy forever. I think there's more victims." So, and I was like, "So do I. I think there's more victims too. Let's find them together." So like Bill and I created this friendship, and Bill just so happened to have been the whistleblower cop against this former Chicago homicide detective named Ronaldo Guevara. And Ronaldo Guevara, who operated in the 90s and early 2000s in the city of Chicago, mostly in Hispanic neighborhoods, was ultimately using his confidential informants along with other ploys to arrest and get convictions on innocent people on cold case murders. And he ended up, I think he ended up getting 53 innocent people convicted on homicides that they did not commit. A majority of them have served their sentences. And it was like Dorsch was the cop who brought it to the attention of his bosses, who all said, "Bill, what are you doing? We don't do this here. You don't, like, what are you doing? Like, those cases are closed. Like, why are you trying to reopen that wound, man? It's like, what are you doing?" It's like, are you saying that? So Bill was not received very kindly for kind of saying, "Hey, I just want to let you know that I was sitting here with Guevara and he brought in one of his eyewitnesses to one of these murders, and the kid pointed at the wrong guy in a book in terms of the picture." And Guevara then turned around and said, "Oh, you mean this guy?" and pointed out to the picture of the guy that he had collared for it. And Bill went in and he's like, "What?" So Bill knew right away. Like, Bill stayed on for maybe a year more, just getting resistance. And ultimately he had to retire. Like, they forced him into retirement because he was coming at Guevara and just would not touch his cases. He was distancing. So he's like, "Dude, this guy is dirty as shit. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to have anything to do with it. I'm not getting caught up in his shit. No one's going to be," because Bill's like an honest, like, Bill's who we want as cops, right? Yeah. I mean, like, this guy's like a genuinely great guy who really cares about people and who's out there really trying to do good. It's like a true do-gooder cop. It's like, the dream cop. And, so they ended up chasing him out of the country. Like, seriously, he lives over in Europe now. And both of his sons are Chicago cops. They put bricks on their careers. Neither one of them were both highly decorated, have ever been promoted. It's like, so, yeah, I mean, when Bill exposed that, Now 44 of them have been fully exonerated.
Jeez.
And Chicago's paying out anywhere from, 7 to 20 million per case. It's
This is why
unbelievable.
my property taxes have gone up, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
It is. It's the Guevara
Yeah,
fund,
well,
man.
it's interesting, man, because you talk about he blew the whistle and everything. They were like, no, we don't want you opening up these cases.
Right.
It's like Lester Freeman in The Wire, right? When he opens up the row houses and there's a body in every house and the leadership.
It's exactly like that, dude.
Don't do that.
Exactly what it was.
It all
like
comes
that.
back to The Wire, Dan, every time.
Dude, Dan, are you a Wire guy?
Oh, yes, I am.
All right. So we have three Wire guys.
He's tired of me referencing it all the time.
Oh, well, Andrew, I'm going to tell you right now, I will never, ever grow tired of you referencing The Wire.
Okay.
My
good
favorite
to
show
know.
of all time.
Well, I think you're painting me fair. I think you're painting me unfairly there.
But what I was going to say is, because when I asked you about the problems in the American justice system, and obviously this is a larger conversation, but a lot of that stuff that you're talking about all stems from the pressure to clear cases. Cops have to clear homicides, clearance rate, quota, political pressure, all of that stuff just goes into that bucket. I'm not exonerating a cop for making up convictions, but it obviously all kind of stems from that issue, right?
100%. But like you said, that's a much bigger conversation. That's like the other side of it. That's the part of it that predates us as the lawyers coming into the case. Yeah. So once we come into it, but again, that's what our role is as the defense attorney. It really is. It's when I'm telling people, look, if we're not filing a motion to suppress based on what we believe was a violation of that guy or gal's rights in terms of the search that they did, who's doing it? And if we're not doing it, and say, for instance, we win the motion to suppress because the judge agrees, said, look, officer, you violated this guy's rights. Why? You should have just done it by the book. We wouldn't have had a problem. This lawyer wouldn't have had a motion to write, and I'm going to have to suppress that evidence so that dude walks. So the finger doesn't get pointed, or it shouldn't be being pointed at the defense attorney for doing their job and calling out the cop on the dirty work. It should be pointed at the cop for doing his shit dirty.
Yeah.
So it's we are the checks and balances for the police, the criminal defense attorneys, literally. We are the ones who protect the Constitution for us. No one else does it. The cops and the prosecutors are the government. The Constitution was drafted for us as the citizens to tell the government, this is what you cannot do to us. We did that already over in England, and we didn't like it. So now we're forming our own country here, and we're making some rules for what y'all can do and what y'all can't do. And when they start violating it, if you don't have defense attorneys saying, hey, you screwed up, because if we don't do it, they're going to think that they can do it all the time. It's like you give them an inch and they take a mile type concept, because that's exactly what's going to happen. If you've got a cop who once decides I'm going to fudge this one because I feel like I got the right guy, but I just don't have the probable cause to get the warrant, and it's they take that step too far. You just you have to call them on it, because then it's such a slippery slope that it creates the potential for us living in a completely different society than we're accustomed to living in. So yeah, man, that part of it is definitely part of it. Obviously. I mean, that's what I'm talking about. The power of the state. I mean, you do not know a human being on an individual basis that has more power than any of your cop buddies. That badge and that gun can alter lives in a way that almost nobody else on the planet can.
I don't know if you're setting up the segue here, Bob, but it would be remiss of us, for the three of us, to not spend a little time talking about the Delphi case. We're all known for covering it at different phases of the story. Andrew and I, we did the Down the Hill podcast, which kind of took the story up until Richard Allen's arrest. And then, that show went away just because the company went away that owned the show. But, around that point, you took up the mantle. At what point did you discover and get learn more, get fascinated by this case?
I was always aware of it just because of proximity to us here in Chicago. I mean, Delphi's a stone's throw from us, 2.5 hour drive. So I was always aware of it, but like I was practicing like during the time, in 2017 when the homicides took place. So, I was watching from afar and, I would dabble in, some Reddit subs and look at it a little bit, but I wasn't creating content at that point. So, I mean, like in terms of that, I wasn't really doing anything with it. So in 2021, when I started the podcast, my first year was almost exclusively Gacy because I was just trying like a mofo to get that thing done. You guys know, how much, and this is like a 2-man team between Darren and I trying to get this thing out.
Again,
So it's like that was all encompassing, but it was driving me nuts that I wasn't able to cover all the current stuff that's going on. So as a matter of fact, really, I think the first thing I decided, like, okay, I can't take it anymore. I'm creating the docket. I'm bringing Allison on as my co-host, and we're going to start covering current cases. And I think it was the Adnan Syed when when Mosby filed that motion seeking to vacate the conviction. Like that was, I couldn't take it anymore. I'm like, I'm going in. So I started with that. And then shortly thereafter in October, we get the arrest.
Yep.
And immediately my ears perk up. I'm like, whoa. I'm like, all right. So I start taking a look at it immediately. And then I start seeing, well, they haven't released the probable cause affidavit. I'm like, scratching my head. That's weird. Like probable cause affidavits, I mean, they're public. Like it's a public filing. It's like it's very rare for those to be kept sealed. So I'm like, this is interesting, and then finally when that thing gets revealed and they unseal it, I'm looking at it and I'm like, oh, wow, they don't have much evidence here. I'm concerned about this probable cause affidavit. I'm like, they have to get more. It's because like people need to understand that concept. And if you talk to any true prosecutors, they will tell you it is a far cry from getting an arrest warrant on a case and just having to meet the probable cause standard in terms of the difference between beyond a reasonable doubt to get a conviction in a case. So like when they made that arrest, I was certain that they were very confident that they were going to be able to find connections between whoever it may be, Richard Allen and whoever, whether it be Kagan Klein, Ron Logan, whoever. Because they like, I don't care what they're saying now. They always said that they thought that there were multiple people that were involved in that crime. They can't erase the internet. That's the beauty.
After they arrested him. Yeah.
Yeah. We're going to keep the tip line open. Yeah. I mean, there is no like pretending like that didn't exist
this
in the
case
world.
Is far from over.
Right. All of those things that exist.
Yeah.
So, like I'm thinking that they thought truly, like I think that they believed that Allen was involved. I don't think this was some like we're trying to frame up a dude. I think that they thought, oh my God, like how did we miss this statement? This guy put himself here. It's at the time that we think that the murders took place. That's perfect. Let's go. They find this vehicle that looks like his. So, I mean, he lines up perfectly for them. So I think in their minds and in their hearts, they thought that they had the right guy. And so I immediately start following it as soon as I find out that the PCA was sealed. And then when it gets unsealed, then I'm all in, because
I think we were all like, that's it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and that was just like I've been reading probable cause affidavits for a long time. And I kept getting a lot of pushback early on. Those folks like, oh, they're not putting the strongest evidence in the probable cause affidavit. I'm like, oh, yeah, they are. Yeah, they are. I'm like, and I'm like arguing with people who have no idea what they're talking about. And I'm like, look, the only way I can describe a probable cause affidavit is they're going to put, especially in a case like this, they're going to put their best foot forward. That is literally the narrative that the media is going to be using for the next however many years pending trial, that this is the guy, we got the right guy. So they're not going to limp in. They're not going to hold back their strongest evidence because there's no purpose in doing that. None. There is no purpose. The defense is getting all the discovery, and frankly, they don't want to have the media reporting, wow, this seems like a super weak case. So for those two reasons, they're never going to limp in. If they have powerful evidence, they're going to list it all in the probable cause affidavit. So I knew at that point that was all they had. And I just kept saying, I'm like, they're hoping that they're going to get more post-arrest because they do have more access to the defendant than at any other point post-arrest. So when you're getting into all of his electronics, you get the searches, you start interviewing people because now you're not trying to be, surreptitious. Like when you're closing in on somebody, you're not trying to be open and obvious about it. You're trying to be sneaky. You're trying to get some answers without alerting that person that you're onto them, right? So once the arrest is made, that's all gone. Now you can just go interview everybody. You're trying to dig up as much as you can. So many times you'll see all that kind of stuff. Let me turn on the light. You'll see all that stuff kind of get found after the arrest. Tons of evidence is typically found after the arrest. So yeah, from that perspective, man, I was like, wow, something's weird. And then, we'd have to have an hour to go through the process. And I think we've probably already talked about it already, but ultimately, it smelled bad to me. Like there was something weird about it, the way that it was handled.
Like to give our listeners a chance to weigh in or ask questions or make comments for some of the guests that we have on this show. And, I think I'll just throw this one out here from Sarah Pugh from Patreon, or Pugh, Sarah Pugh from Patreon. Thanks for writing it. And she says she doesn't seem like she is as, it's interesting. We know so much about the Richard Allen trial and the Delphi case that it's difficult to imagine or easy to forget sometimes that not everyone knows about it like we do, right?
Right.
It's not as everyone's conscious that we do. But Sarah says, from what I've heard so far, and this is from a couple weeks ago, at post-conviction, there isn't much physical evidence tying him to the murders. I worry the real killer might still be out there. I also worry that he was in a psychotic state and falsely confessed. It would be great for someone to clarify what was really presented as evidence and whether he was really given a fair trial.
I mean, look, in terms of it's a huge question with not a simple answer.
No.
I mean, it depends. If you're of the mindset that Gull made the right decision in terms of her ruling and saying that the defense could not put forth any third-party culprits, and you think that that's fair, then you're going to think it was a fair trial.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? If you're of the mindset that it's okay to put pretrial detainees into a prison, not only a prison, but the most secure prison, and in the most secure cell in the most secure prison in the state of Indiana for 13 months, to cut him off for the first several months from any physical contact, like him laying eyes on the person he needed most, which was Kathy Allen, his wife, and just shut him down. Because I see people like, he had a tablet. He could text and call on it. I'm like, you don't understand, man. Like you rip somebody out of their life and you throw them in an 8x12 box with no windows and just complete sensory deprivation for months and cut them off from any kind of lifeline to the outside world. And the reality of what's going on with you starts to set in. And then you add in guards that think that you're a murderer of two beautiful young girls, convicted felons who are in that same pod because they're unable to be put out into the gen pop because they're that horrible, in that pod with you, coming at you daily, all day, every day. You're going to, I mean, if you think that that's fair, then I guess you could say it was a fair trial. I mean, if you think that, because like, I would love nothing more. And the way that I keep trying to explain this, because I have no idea if Richard Allen did this or didn't do it. Like, people confuse that. They conflate that with me all the time, and they're just wrong. Like, my content speaks for itself. You're never going to hear the words out of me because I don't know, because I wasn't there. You're never going to hear me say, Richard Allen's innocent. I can feel like they got it wrong based on the evidence that they have, or at the very least feel very insecure about that conviction, which is where I'm at. I respect it because the jury came to a conclusion based on the evidence they were presented.
But the problem, Bob, and I'll just say this, and this is not any fault of yours. You're right. But the problem is that we live in a world now where oftentimes these cases and these trials become a home team and a visitor team. There's no referee. There's nobody standing at the 50-yard line looking at both sides. And it's like you have to declare which one you're on.
And it's almost like politics. If you believe the other thing, then you are the enemy, right? If you don't agree with me, then you are bad. You are wrong. You are
right.
You are maliciously intended.
Right. So nobody's going to listen to your content and walk away going, Bob Motta doesn't know if he's guilty or not. Nobody's going to do that.
Even
because
though Bob I will say Bob does say that. Did say that.
Well, right. No, and that's why I'm saying.
All the time.
That's what I'm saying. This is no fault of yours.
Yeah.
It's a fault of the dialogue around these cases that exists now, in which you have to be one or the other.
Dude, you are absolutely speaking gospel. And here's the deal. I don't give a shit. No one's ever going to force me to a side. Like no one's ever going to do it. But they try to do it anyway.
Yeah.
Like they what they do is they twist my words and they turn it into me picking a side where I haven't picked a side. And I know that drives people nuts. They don't like fence riders.
No,
they do. And you know, the stark reality of it is that in almost every circumstantial case where there are just a lot of issues, like I'm almost always a fence rider. Like I'm always torn. Because with circumstantial cases, there has to be that point in time where you just say, okay, I'm never going to get the smoking gun piece of evidence. I have to accept that there is enough powerful circumstantial evidence that even though I'm not getting a definitive answer, I have to allow my common sense to lead me to the point, like it had to have been this person. No one else could have done it. So, you know, and there's plenty of cases like that because most of our cases are circumstantial. I feel very, very secure. And even though there is a presumption of innocence with Rex Heuermann, I feel very, very secure that they got the right person in that case. And that is because they did yeoman's work during that investigation. Granted, it was 10 years too late. I think that they could have gotten him back when they had all those tips early on.
Evidence. They have DNA for him. You know,
right.
I think with Richard Allen, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on Delphi, the combined, we have hundreds of hours of content about that. So
we do.
But I think we could all agree that if he is guilty, the state, the mechanisms of power did not get there in the right way. And if he's not guilty, well, there's an appeal process, but there is a lot of that jury was not allowed to hear.
Yeah. And look, I mean, and that's gospel. Like that's like this thing's going to go through that process. And what I was trying to warn people about, because our channel really focuses on reading the documents. Like I was never the guy speculating about facts because I didn't know the facts. I didn't know the evidence. I knew most of what I knew about the case from your goddamn podcast down the hill. Like the things that I knew about it were from what you guys were able to call, you know, through your hard work and, you know, and your ability to be able to talk to people that would open up to you a bit. So, and it was limited, you know what I mean? It's like, we didn't know anything until the thing went to trial. So like, that was not my game. My game was to look at the pleadings, look at the things that are being filed, see if they're on the up and up. Are they doing this process the way that it should be done in a way that we can trust it? We need to be able to trust our systems of government. And the judicial system is no different than our federal government and our state government. You need to be able to trust them. And it's hard to do. And when they do a bunch of shady shit, which is just how I feel about it. And you know what? I'm not going to argue with people about it. Because you know when that argument will be decided, when the appellate court looks at it. Yep. And then when the Supreme Court of Indiana looks at it. And then if they deny it, when the federal courts look at it. And if they deny it, then when the Supreme Court of the United States looks at it, it could make it all the way up there. Like, you know what I'm saying? So like, I'm going to let those people that are going to look at the law, and they're going to be the ones to give us the decisions, whether or not Bob Motta was right, saying that this process was screwed up. I say that she screwed up a lot. Ultimately, what this thing's going to boil down to in that case is, does the manifest weight of all of those confessions, are those in the eyes of the appellate court going to say, okay, yeah, Gull screwed up here, here, and here, but you've got 61 confessions or whatever the number is, and there was at no point 61 confessions that were heard during that trial. I don't know where that number came from. I don't know if it was like, if Alan said I did it 5 times during one phone call, they consider that 5 different confessions. It had to be, because we only heard 9 phone calls.
Yeah.
I'm sure they did. Yeah.
Yeah. So, like
if I were the prosecution, I would have.
Yeah. Like, oh yeah. He said I did it 73 times in one phone call. So he confessed 73 times. So, but like the problem for the appellate court is going to be if they give those the weight, if they ignore the conditions of his confinement, if they don't find that to be compelling, and they say, look, this dude admitted doing it 61 times. It wouldn't mattered to a jury if we had allowed the third party culprit stuff in. It wasn't going to outweigh those confessions. Therefore, all of those other issues, which we feel that Gull did err on, were harmless error, because nothing outweighs the confession. So, and that's a distinct possibility in this case. That is an absolutely distinct possibility. I mean, people that I know that are much wiser than me as to Indiana law, that handle appellate work, are not at all convinced that they're going to have any luck at the appellate level. They think if they're going to have any luck over in Indiana in terms of this argument that the conditions of the confinement globally, like in totality, are what really caused him to start confessing, as opposed to like just an intense read technique interrogation. But that it was the long con there. It was like, look, we're going to put him in. We're going to sensory deprivation. We're going to cut off his lifelines to his family, or he's going to go insane. He did go insane. We're going to start pumping him up with Haldol, and this dude's going to start talking, and we're going to be telling him, look, it's easy. You want to see Kathy? Just say you did it, dude. Just say you did. Like that would have been the move if you're them. It's not, we're going to kill your wife, we're going to kill your family. Like, you need to, like, feeding him lines. It's like, and then you've got the wallet thing. Like, how can you trust a woman who's digging into the case of the person that she's treating? There has to be a level that we
YouTube videos about
dude, she was a member of my group. She became a member of Defense Diaries group the day of the safekeeping hearing after she testified in court. Let that resonate. Like, I want nothing more than to be able to trust everything. Like, I want to feel like, okay, he confessed, he's done. If he had made these confessions in Cass County where they were letting him see Kathy twice a month, and he just started spilling his guts, I'm feeling way more secure about these confessions than doing what they did to him. I mean, how else can you put it, right?
You can't. Yeah, you can't. Hopefully more will be heard and judged once we get to appeal. But I'm gonna, once we get the Delphi snowball rolling anymore, we'll be on for another 2 hours. And,
dude, I know you were smart to put it at the end. That was sage. It was a sage move, man.
I'm gonna wrap up, and you've been so generous with your time. And one of the reasons I am also stopping is because I only said I'd hold you for an hour, but we held you more.
I love hanging with you guys.
Oh, we love you. And the last question that we like to always ask someone at the end of the interview is, what did we not ask you that we should have? If you were interviewing you, what would you ask that we didn't?
Probably what's most important to me in my life, and that would unequivocally be my kids and my wife, my family, man. I think everybody, when you're having a tough day, you just need to kind of take a step back, because life is brutal for all of us. Life on a daily basis is absolutely brutal. It's just filled with gut shot after gut shot. Like, every time you're on that high, man, right behind that thing is a gut shot just to bring you back down. Yeah. We live in that world, man. And, just focus on the things that matter most in our lives. And that's the people that you love, and your kids and your family. And, it's like we live in a dark place because of what we do for a living, all three of us do. And it's nice to be able to take a step back, take a breath, and just hug your kids, hug your wife.
If people do want to follow your career, and I recommend that they do, there's plenty of places they could find you, listen to your Gacy show. There's Defense Diaries. There's The Docket, available on YouTube and podcasts, anywhere. What am I missing? There's lots of places that one can experience one or both Mottas.
I mean, you really nailed all of it. YouTube, we've been growing that. We just broke 35,000 on our YouTube channel. So that's awesome,
and I have
man.
to say, you have done such an amazing job of building a community around your channel. It's just been so fun to watch that grow for you, and like how passionate your community is. And they really are.
They really are. And they're all just wonderful human beings. Yeah. And we really, we are not an echo chamber. Like I am always up for the debate. Like that is the thing about me. I will never shy away from the debate. And, and my position isn't like that I know anything. Mm-hmm. Like I can only defend my opinion, because again, like if we're debating a case where I wasn't there, I can't pretend to know the answer. I could never do that. Right. And like the person who acts adamant that they do know the answer, in my mind, I'm saying you're full of shit. You weren't there. It's like, I understand your position. However, let's argue the evidence or lack thereof. And like, let's go. So yeah, our YouTube channel is great. It's Defense Diaries podcast. I've got a pretty active Twitter account, and that's Defense _podcast or Defense _Diaries. Yeah. And then, obviously Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your pods, that's where you'll find the docket and Defense Diaries, which are unfortunately still under the same Defense Diaries.
I know. I wish there was a better, easier way to do that stuff.
Yeah, I've got to set the little guy, the docket, out on its own. It's now in the toddler stage. I feel like I can set it out on its own, and it'll probably fall on its butt a few times, but it's ready. It's ready for it.
Bob Motta, thank you so much.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate it, buddy.
Always, fellas. Thanks for having me.